Welcome to Unit 1 of the course Social Work, Law, and Policy in the Caribbean. Let's begin by defining crime. Crime is a term that you are sure you know until you're asked to define it. It can indeed be convoluted. We will focus our development of a definition by exploring two concepts: 1, relativity, and 2, law. Let's start with the characteristics of a crime. A crime is both relatively and objectively defined. This means that for something to be called a crime, it must have an objectively agreed upon way to be so called. Crime is relative in terms of time and space. Space includes geography as well as other things. Here is an example to demonstrate the relativity of crime. Let's consider these four men: Jesus Christ, Socrates, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela. What would you say all these men have in common? The majority of you would say they're all famous men in history. I concur, but all these men were criminals and were punished for their crimes. I can imagine the disbelief on your faces, so take a few seconds to digest that information. Jesus Christ and Socrates both criticized the status quo and were executed for their crimes against the state. The other two men also broke laws, were criminalized, and later vindicated. Yet these are four of the most famous men in history. But are they labeled as criminals now? The answer is no. In fact, many of us recognize Jesus Christ as the Son of God. These four men provide a good indicator of the variations and relativity of crime. A crime and criminal behavior must demonstrate and satisfy the following three characteristics. 1. A crime must be historically relative and relevant. 2. A crime must be confined to a jurisdiction. This means to administer justice within a defined area of responsibility, such as the nation-state. And 3, state processes, meaning the criminal justice institutions and policies of the state, must label the action and/or activity a crime. Émile Durkheim was a French philosopher who was also known as the father of sociology. In his book Suicide, A Study in Sociology, he made the point that a society without crime would be a pathologically over-controlled society. Let us think about this for just a minute. The implication is that crime as a concept is inevitable, it is measurable, and it is necessary to ensure human freedom. Although crime is subjective, it is not abstract. Crime is an interaction of processes involving an event and the responses to that event. For a process to be initiated, an initial event is required, and the event needs to be governed by rules. These rules form the laws and legislation, all concepts with which we are now familiar. We also appreciate that the law, like crime, is relative. In other words, an event labeled criminal in one jurisprudence may not be a crime in another jurisprudence. This is because laws are only enforceable and relevant to specific geographical or constituted nation-states. Furthermore, laws are made, called legislation, by people through a process of governance, for example, Parliament, and in some constitutions by precedents, i.e. rules emanating from court proceedings. A crime is a behavior that is in breach of legally defined rules. Hence, without laws, there are no crimes. Please remember this important concept. Not only does the law define and label criminal behavior, it prohibits, requires a specific action and a specific status for that behavior to be criminal. For there to be a crime, it must be a breach of the law, there must be an established criminal proceedings, for example, a criminal justice system, and an anticipated form of enforcement, and the act of being criminal must have the status of the act, meaning that the knowing and responsibility that the act is against the law. In summary, a crime is committed if we have the guilty act, called in Latin actus reus, and the guilty mind, mens rea. Together they equal the knowing and the responsibility for the criminal behavior. To return to the concept of crime, it needs to be within the context referred to in criminological literature as a social construct, meaning that a crime is only relevant in a prescribed social setting. For example, taking a pen from work is a crime, Since it is not your pen, it's the employer's pen. However, the law in this case is seldom enforced, and I'm sure you can think of many similar examples. Crime is a product of our society's rules and laws, which in turn are products of religion, authority, doctrine, morality, and values. All concepts we will grapple with in this unit. Crime is confined within a particular jurisprudence, for example, the nation-state, and more recently it can be extended to regional and international social context. And finally, a good example that crime is relative. It is criminal to compare crime data of one country with another without accounting for the relativity of crime. So now we answer the question of what is a crime. It is what the law says it is, in that particular place, and at that time, and of that action. And I ask that you remember two truth sayings of Dr. Lystra. Without law, there is no crime, and without crime, a society is without freedom. Please remember these important concepts, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.